Hi there, I'm Todd Miller, 7-8 culinary arts teacher with Lakehead Public Schools. I've got another recipe for you to try today, but before we start, a few reminders. First off, if you're unsure about any of the equipment that you're going to be using, make sure you ask someone that has some more kitchen experience, especially when you're working around the stove, oven, and even the microwave. Make sure you understand how they work, and always have a pair of oven mitts handy, even for the microwave. Some of the equipment gets hot in there. If the recipe calls for the use of a knife, make sure that you're really comfortable using a sharp knife like this. Again, ask somebody that has some experience and practice first before using it for your recipe. Always hold the knife with a lot of conviction in one hand, and with your other hand, you want to make sure that you keep your hand in that claw position, kind of like you're holding a tennis ball. Always keep your hand curled back so that the knife doesn't come in contact with your fingertips. Before you start the recipe, make sure you watch the entire video, read the recipe entirely through, make sure you understand everything, and of course, get all of your equipment and your ingredients out first. It makes the recipe go a lot more smoothly. And finally, don't forget, you made the mess, you're in charge of cleaning up. Don't leave a dirty kitchen for someone else. So have a great time cooking. So today we're going to take a look at chocolate chip cookies. I have two chocolate chip cookie recipes. On another video, you'll find one for puffy chocolate chip cookies. This one's are crispy chocolate chip cookies. So these are the chocolate chip cookies that are really crispy on the outside, really thin and large. They spread out quite a bit when they're cooking. These kind of chocolate chip cookies can also be made at home with less tools. It is still great if you have a stand mixer to use them to make these chocolate chip cookies, but if you don't have one of these at home, we can get by with a hand mixer. If you don't have a hand mixer either, you still can make it. It's a little bit more work to mix everything up together, but you can still make it with just a wooden spoon as well. So today we're going to use our hand mixer to make these ones. Got two bowls on the go, one for our dry ingredients and another for our wet ingredients. We'll add them together at the end. Now we're going to start off with some flour. I need 1.5 cups of flour. So I scoop my flour in, it's overflowing, scrape off the extra so I get the exact right amount. Find a lot of bakers right now, when they're baking, they don't actually measure in cups anymore like this because they can measure them a little bit differently. They measure in grams, they use weight instead. But we'll stick with this measurement because not everyone has a scale at home. So 1.5 cups of flour, use my half cup measurement 3 times to get to 1.5 cups. And we're also going to need a little bit of baking soda. We need 3/4 of a teaspoon. Most little sets like these don't have a 3/4 one, but I can make 3/4. By starting off with a half, which is the same as 2/4, and then I add another 1/4 to get to 3/4. So 1/2 plus 1/4 gives us 3/4. I also need 1/2 teaspoon of salt as well. So those are all I need for my dry ingredients. I use my whisk to make sure that everything's well incorporated. It only takes about 10-15 seconds to do that. And once that's done, we can move on to the wet ingredients, which we'll do in a separate bowl. I'm using a larger bowl for my wet ingredients because the dry ingredients are going to be going into the wet ingredients. That's another reason why it's good to read the whole recipe first. It kind of tells you sometimes what goes into what. So into my large bowl, I'm going to start off with some sugars first. We're using 2 kinds of sugars for this. We're going to be using a 1/2 cup of white granulated sugar. That's the kind of sugar that most people know about. So I just use my hand, cheat a little bit to scrape that off. 1/2 cup of that. And we're going to use 1/3 cup of brown sugar. Now when I scraped out my white sugar, I just scooped it up. With my brown sugar though, I'm packing it down. Trying to get as much brown sugar there as possible. So I've got a little tiny bit extra, scrape that off. But we want a really packed one, kind of like making a sandcastle. So I'll add that in there as well. So I'll just give my little sugars a stir first, just to mix them up a little bit. And to that, we're adding our butter. In this case, we're using 1/2 cup of butter, which is the same as 115 grams, because it's kind of hard to measure butter sometimes in these cups. This butter is melted. My other cookie recipe calls for really cold butter. This is the exact opposite. It's melted butter. But I've melted it already on the stove and then let it cool a little bit. We don't want to pour hot butter in here. I could also melt it in a microwave as well too, probably about 40 seconds depending on the type of microwave. As always, be careful. But this is nice and cool now, so I'm just going to pour that in. And then we're going to add a couple more wet ingredients and we'll mix everything all together at once. I'm going to add in my egg as well, but in this case I'm only going to be using the yolk or the yellow part of the egg. So for that, I'm gonna crack my egg. When you're opening an egg up, remember you're pulling apart with your thumbs. You're not pushing down. And as it starts to open, I'm gonna make sure that the yolk just goes into one half of the egg. Then, if I carefully move the yolk back and forth, all of the white stuff will drop down, into my little bowl, and my yolk will stay inside the shell. Just scrape out everything extra on here, and then we're ready now to add our yolk in. So, just before we get to the next dry ingredients, we'll give this a quick stir first, just to mix everything up a little bit. Always start with the lowest setting, because you don't want it spraying up all around you. You might have to, I can see I'm holding onto the bowl to make sure it sticks. I can scrape down the bowl as I'm stirring. Some people don't have little protectors on the bottom of their bowl, so you might need to make sure that you're holding onto the bowl the whole time. Just make sure that's all scraped together there. Now I've got that mixed in, I can add my other wet ingredients to that. Got a couple more things to add. We're going to add a little bit of milk, just 2 tablespoons, not very much. We're also going to add 2 tablespoons of corn syrup. This makes our cookies even more crispy, makes them a bit more brown on the outside. If you don't have any corn syrup at home, don't panic. It's not going to destroy the recipe. You can make them without them, but it is best if you've got that corn syrup to add as well too. So I've got that. And then we're going to add vanilla. Now normally when I cook, I usually add probably around a teaspoon of vanilla, which is 5 milliliters. This recipe calls for a lot of vanilla. There's a lot of flavor to our cookies. A full tablespoon or 15 milliliters. That's a good amount of vanilla. Once I've added that, I can get my mixer back on again. My cord's kind of short, so I can't go very close with this. Give that another little stir up. So we wouldn't want to mix these together with our flour right away. We want to make sure all of our wet ingredients are mixed together in one bowl, and our dry ingredients are mixed in another bowl. Some people get confused about sugar because it measures like a dry ingredient, and it is a dry ingredient. But sugar mixes really well with butter, so we often put our butter in with the wet bowl. Sorry, our sugars and our butter together in with the wet bowl. So now that I've got it mixed together, I'll add some of my dry ingredients, give it a little bit of a mix. Again, on the lowest setting, or else all that flour might fly up into my face. Once that's mixed in a little bit, I'll add the rest of it. I turn off the mixer in between so my mixing paddles don't accidentally touch the bowl, cause a bit of a disaster. And if you haven't used a hand mixer at all, make sure you ask somebody first. Our dough's getting nice and thick now, our batter's getting all mixed together well. Now I can turn it up a little bit more. It's creaming together really nicely. Lift up a little bit to get all that extra batter off, so I don't have a lot of batter on my beaters. And now I'll add my chocolate chips. And I'm just going to stir those in by hand, I find. We need about 3/4 of a cup of chocolate chips. If you want to use a bit more, it's up to you. Now normally I would use semi-sweet chocolate chips for these. They don't tend to melt as much, but I don't have any at home today. That doesn't matter. I'm going to use some milk chocolate chips. When I went to measure my milk chocolate chips, I didn't have enough, but I had some sea salt caramel ones left over to get me to my full amount. There's so many different types of chocolate chips out there now. We got Score bits, you've got M&Ms and Reese's Pieces ones. You can mix in whatever you like. So I'm going to mix this all together using a spatula. See, there's lots of chocolate chips mixed in throughout. There we go. Now we're just going to let that sit for a couple of seconds. I gather the rest of my tools, and then we'll get these onto our baking sheet and get ready to stick them in the oven. Okay, so we've got our tools ready. We're ready to put these crispy chocolate chip cookies on a baking tray and get them in the oven. Now, we'd like to use a cookie tray like this, a cookie tray that's flat and has absolutely no sides or just a little tiny lip of a side like this. But don't panic. If this is all you have at home, we call this a baking sheet. It has a thicker side. If this is all you have, that's absolutely fine. They'll still work. They might not be quite as crispy though, because the hot air from the oven isn't able to get all around the cookie quite as much. So we'll use the pan we're supposed to use, but you can use either one at home. We do need to spray the pan first Parchment paper, cooking spray, or butter, they all do the trick. I just use some cooking spray. And now we want to make small little chocolate chip cookie balls on here that we're going to bake. We've got to keep them pretty far apart, at least 5 centimeters or 2 inches apart on there, because they are going to spread out as they bake. Now, a couple different ways to do that. You could use a spoon and flatten them out together a little bit like that. You could just scoop some up with your fingers, small amount like this, and roll it into a ball. Or, best of all, a lot of cooks are using this now, little ice cream scoops. They even come in all sorts of different sizes. This is a pretty small one, and this is a great little tool for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's really easy to get the batter, and because of the little handle on the side, it plops right out. As well, you get the exact same amount every time. When we're baking, if we're baking something like cookies, we want them all to cook at about the same time and for about the same amount. And if they're different sizes, they might not cook the same. So by using something like an ice cream scoop, they even call them baking scoops now, not even ice cream scoops anymore, we can get the exact right amount of batter every time. But if you don't have one of these, that's okay. You still saw the other ways of doing it, and any of them will work. I'm only going to fit 9 to a pan on this, so it takes a bit longer to bake each batch. But at this point, I could throw a batch in the oven, in my preheated 350 degree oven. Going to take about 12 minutes. Or I could take this tray now and I could put it in the freezer. Let them freeze completely, and now I have a whole bunch of chocolate chip cookies all set to bake. All I have to do is preheat an oven and throw them in. So you can make some of these to eat right now, put the rest of them in the freezer, and save them for another day. But we'll get these ones in the oven, 12 minutes like I said. I might even spin the baking pan around halfway through to make sure they all get the same amount of heat evenly, and then we'll take a look and see what happened to them. Alright, we've had a chance to cook our crispy chocolate chip cookies. About 12 minutes, depends on your oven, for about 12 minutes in a 350 degree oven. Remember to use an oven mitt when you're taking them out. And you can see that they are very, very flat, nice and brown on top. They did spread out quite a bit. Now I can't take these off the tray right away. If I do, they'll kind of fall apart because they're much too soft right now. So you've got to wait for about 3 minutes before you take them off. And once you take them off, they do need to go onto a rack like this for a little while first to finish cooling off. So I've got my first batch where I did that. Remember, we're cooking 9 at a time, where I've taken them off. They're nice and flat, nice and crispy, light brown on the bottom. They're perfect, ready to eat. These can be kept in a sealed container for a couple of days as well. They stay nice and fresh that way. Or, like I said as well earlier, you can make them up, put them on the tray, but put the tray in the freezer instead. And then you'll have pre-formed cookies all set to go that you can enjoy anytime. Don't forget to clean up when you're all done, and then enjoy these crispy chocolate chip cookies. Happy cooking.